Policy Program Seminar. Today we're being joined by Katie Baldiga, who is one of our PhD students here at the Department of Economics. And as you know, the Women in Public Policy Program focuses on finding replicable interventions from small to large scale to close gender gaps in the areas of economic opportunity, political participation, education, and health. Katie Baldiga has been here at the university for some time, and we're particularly interested in her topic because it impacts all of us, focusing on gender differences and the willingness to guess and the implications for test scores. And in a university setting, as you would expect, our newer understanding through her work of who we're enrolling and what these test scores may mean has been very important to us as we think about our processes here at HKS and throughout the university. Before joining us here, Katie graduated summa cum laude from Williams in economics and mathematics. Her research interests include, of course, gender and economics, as well as political economy and the theory of social change and microeconomics. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Katie.
Great. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be here talking about this project. And I want to start by thanking the Women in Public Policy program in particular. They actually provided a lot of the funding for this project. So I want to thank you for being big supporters of this project from the beginning, and I'm excited to talk to you about some of my results now. And I know we're setting aside time for questions at the end. I'm happy to take questions throughout, so please feel free to raise hands, interrupt me. So I think it's easy to convince everyone that we often face difficult questions that we're not sure we know the answer to. So you could think about social settings or professional settings, like board meetings or interviews, or even seminar presentations. We get asked a difficult question, we're not really sure what the right answer is. And we actually have a lot of different strategies, right? So we could give a best guess, we could say we don't know. Maybe on something like the SAT, we could skip the question entirely. So let's think about that standardized test context. The SATs, in particular the SAT-1, is a big determinant of whether and where you go to college. It's taken by nearly 2 million students every year. And it's not only used to sort of determine where you go to school, but there are a lot of programs now that use this to forecast your achievement throughout life, right? How successful are you going to be? So the SATs consist of mostly multiple choice questions. Each multiple choice question has 5 possible answers. You get 1 point for a right answer. You lose a small penalty, 1/4 of a point for a wrong answer, and 0 points if you skip the question. Now, if you're risk neutral, even if you're choosing answers at random, right, answering every question sort of maximizes, at least weakly maximizes your expected score. So if we think that test takers at least have a little bit of information about the question, maybe can rule out an answer, or even just think that one answer might be more likely than the others, they should always be guessing. Now in any particular question, right, we think this difference is small, but over the course of a long test, like 170 questions on the SAT-1, a strategy of skipping questions could really hurt you. You're losing fractions of a point, sort of, as they build up over time. So I'm going to focus on this SAT context, and I want to explore whether there are gender differences in the tendency to skip questions. Are women maybe less likely to guess? So we have some limited evidence from real test data and field studies suggesting that women may indeed skip more questions than men on tests. So this first paper, this Hirschfield, Moore, and Brown, is looking at the old economics GRE subject test, so a test that graduate students used to get into economics graduate school. And they find that women are less likely to guess, and they argue that this may have been part of the reason that women were underperforming relative to men, given their GPAs in college. We also have one field experiment that looks at this. It's in Israel, and they argue that women skip more questions than men, and it can't be it's not being driven by the fact that women know less about these questions than men. But sort of the issue we have with both of these papers is we don't have a perfect measure of knowledge of the material. So we kind of have the real test data or the field experiment test data, but we don't have any sort of other controls or measure of how much they really know that's not sort of dependent on their skipping strategies. And I want to point out, I'm not going to be able to address this directly in the paper, but I want to be thinking a little bit big picture about this, that a gender gap in skipping questions might help us to explain some sort of well-documented puzzles, right, in the standardized test-taking literature. So people who study the SATs and think about how well they predict performance and also measure past success have found that women's SAT scores are actually under-predictive of their first-year grades in college. Okay, so people are doing, or the women are doing better than we think based upon what they got on their SAT. And the second thing is that there's evidence that women do better on essay-style exams than multiple choice tests. Now, obviously, there are a lot of things going on with both of these, but I just want to say that if we did have a gender difference in willingness to guess on multiple choice tests, this could play a role in at least partially driving either of these things. So I think this is a really good question to look at in the lab, right? So the lab is going to allow us to sort of carefully document whether a gender gap in skipping questions exists. And it's also going to let us gather an important set of controls that we need to sort of understand what's going on better. So I'm going to be able to measure how much my subjects know about the material. I'm going to collect measures of risk preferences and confidence levels, so that if we do see a gender gap in questions skipped, we can start to get a better idea of why we might be seeing this. Is it really about gender, or is it about confidence or risk preferences? The lab also lets me sort of vary aspects of the testing environment. So everyone in this room cares about policy. So this says, what sort of policy changes could I make that might matter for behavior on these tests? So in particular, I'm going to vary the penalty for wrong answers. And I'm also going to vary the salience of the evaluative nature of the task. And I'll make it clear what I mean by that evaluative nature of the task in a little bit. So I'm going to walk through my experimental design. Before I go into the parts in detail, I want to give you an overview. So it's a laboratory experiment with 4 parts. In the first part, the subjects are going to come into the lab, and they're going to take a typical standardized test. Okay, so you can think of this as being similar to an SAT environment. In part 2 then, I'm going to collect a measure of risk preferences in an environment that's sort of as similar as possible to the test-taking environment. In part 3, I'm going to go and I'm going to measure their confidence in their answers, and I'm also going to collect a measure of knowledge of the material. I'm actually going to, use the computer to force them to answer every question, so I can know exactly how well they would have done had they answered every question. That's really the key in getting us away from the field data. This is what the lab lets us do. Okay, and finally, in part 4, this is when I come in and I ask you the demographic questions. So you're not being primed beforehand with gender or any other aspect of your demographic identity. Subjects are given a chance to earn points in parts 1 through 3 based upon their answers. Those points are how I'm going to incentivize people. I'm going to randomly choose one part and pay you for the points you earned on that part, 50 cents per point. Okay, and importantly, you're not going to get any information over the course of the experiment. So you don't know random outcomes or what the answers to the questions are until the experiment ends. So let's talk about these parts in more detail.
Can I just before you get into the details of the experiment, just a very generic question. Do we know anything about why the tests that we typically use, standardized tests, even allow skipping? Are there alternatives? Are there tests which don't allow skipping?
So I think that's an interesting question. I think the root of it is that the fact that for years and years tests were taken with pen and paper. So there's no clear way to force people to answer questions with pen and paper.
Of course.
But as we move to computerized tests, I think this is an interesting question. You'd run into an issue with, if time matters, and there are usually time limits on these tests, then how do we force you to not skip questions in the time allotted or something like that? But it's a good question. All right, so part 1. Part 1 is going to be a 20-question test. We're going to use a mix of practice questions that the College Board actually provides. So these are College Board practice tests that are posted online, and they're posted with answers. So if you're studying for the test, you can kind of go online and check these things out, take them, and see how you did. Instead of using SAT 1 questions, I wanted to choose a subject matter that was a little bit more gender neutral in perception and in performance. So I didn't want to come right in with math and have a lot of other things going on in terms of stereotypes and things like that. So I'm going to use something that's a little bit more gender neutral and use history. And it's a mix of world history and U.S. history questions. Okay, these are SAT 2s. They're the subject tests. Most students are required to take at least 3 in order to apply to college. So most students are familiar with these subject tests. Okay. Our test, all questions are going to appear on the same computer page, so they are on the computer. Okay, they're randomly ordered, and subjects they're modified to only have 4 possible answers. So this is a change from the actual SATs. I made this change for 2 reasons. One is that my subjects haven't been studying for months for these tests. They may not have even taken these courses in high school. So I wanted to make the test slightly easier so people weren't just guessing in the dark. And I also wanted to create a clear incentive to guess in all treatments. Okay, so you're no longer indifferent between skipping and guessing in my experiments. You're always going to want to guess, regardless of which treatment you're assigned.
Were your subjects all college students?
So I'll talk about that. They're subjects at Claire, the Computer Lab for Experimental Research at HBS. About 80% are students of some kind. 60% are actually undergraduates. So here are the incentives. Just like the SAT, you're going to get 1 point for a right answer. You're going to get 0 points for a skipped question. The points you lose are going to depend on the treatment to which you're assigned. So you're going to get randomly assigned to one treatment. You're either going to be in this no penalty condition, where you lose 0 points for a wrong answer, or you're going to be in the penalty condition, where you lose 1/4 of a point. Okay? So the positive, there's always a weakly positive expected value of answering a question. It's actually not weakly positive, it's positive, right? So it's clear and no penalty, you should always guess. And even when there's 1/4 of a penalty, if you guess an answer at random, your expected value is 1/16. Okay. So you take this SAT. Then we move on to part 2. Part 2 is designed to elicit a measure of risk preference in a context as similar as possible to the test-taking environment. Okay, so economists have a lot of good ways of measuring risk now. I was interested in a very specific kind of risk tolerance. And this is the risk tolerance that actually matters for your SATs, I think. Okay, so they're going to take something that looks a lot like the SAT from part 1. They're going to take 20 gambles, and they're going to have to make decisions about these gambles. So a gamble takes the following form. A number is going to be chosen between 1 and 100. If it's less than or equal to some threshold, you're going to get a point. If it's greater than the threshold, you're going to lose a penalty, just like your treatment in part 1. So it's 0 if you're in this no penalty treatment, or 1/4 of a point if you're in the penalty treatment. Okay? You can also just decline the gamble. So this you can think of as like skipping a question. If you decline the gamble, you get 0 points for sure. So they're going to face 20 gambles of sort of random riskiness. So this threshold Y is going to vary between 25 and 100. And you decide whether you want to accept or decline the gambles. So the key here is going to be that accepting a gamble that sort of succeeds Y% of the time is like answering a question you're Y% sure about. Okay, if you decline it, it's like skipping the question. So finally, in part 3, this is the key where I'm going to actually measure how much you know about these questions. So you're going to revisit the same 20 SAT-2 questions from part 1. And this time you have to provide an answer to each question. So they're on the computer. If they leave something blank, they get an error message that says, you have to provide an answer here. Okay. It's the same incentive structure as part 1. So you earn a point if you're right, and you lose some penalty if you're wrong. There's no longer an option to skip questions. In addition, during this part, I want to elicit a measure of confidence. Okay, so the mechanism is a little bit complicated, but it has some really nice properties. Right? So I'm going to give it to you in the language that I use to explain it to the subjects. Imagine there are some robots that are here to help you with this part of the test. Okay? I have 100 different robots. Each one has some integer accuracy. So there's a robot that's accurate 75% of the time. That means if we choose that robot to answer the question for you, the robot will get it right 75% of the time. Okay? So for each question, I want you to write down a threshold. And the threshold says, if I choose a robot that's accurate less than that threshold, I'd rather answer the question myself. If the robot is chosen that has an accuracy greater than the threshold you write down, the robot's going to answer for you instead. Okay, so let me give you an example here. Right? Regardless of risk preference or the penalty treatment you're assigned, you're incentivized to write down your believed probability of getting the question right. So suppose there's a question I'm 80% sure about. Okay? Then I should write down 80% for that question. Let's say I wrote down something higher and I wanted to lie and say I'm actually 90% sure. Right? Then you run the risk that I choose a robot that's 88% accurate, and we choose your answer instead of the robot's, when the robot had a better chance of getting it right. Similarly, if I understate how confident I am, so I write down I'm only 70% sure, then if I choose a robot that's sure 75% of the time, then that robot's going to answer instead of you, and the robot actually has a less chance of getting it right. So this doesn't matter what your risk preferences are. It doesn't matter how many points we're submitting for wrong answers. You should always write down your believed probability of getting the question right. Okay? All right, so finally then in part 4, we just have a series of simple demographic questions. Okay, I'm going to ask you your age, your gender. Yes?
Just so I understand the robots, it's just a hypothetical, or is there some mechanism that you're using?
I'm actually going to use the mechanism. So I'm going to randomly choose a robot, and I'm going to submit your answer to the robots based on that, and you earn points. But importantly, throughout, when I talk about right answers submitted in part 3, I'm only going to talk about the answers they wrote down. So I'm going to ignore the noise in my data analysis of the robots choosing for you. But okay. All right, so I ask you where you're a student, and I also ask you if you've taken or studied for either of these tests. So here I'm worried that someone just took the U.S. History SAT 2, they just used this practice test. Actually, neither of these things seem to matter for my results at all. In very few of my subjects, about a third of them have taken or studied for the US one, and only about 10% have taken or studied for the World History one. So these are pretty unfamiliar tests. So I have 2 main treatments here, or treatment variables. The first one we've already talked about, and this is the size of the penalty for wrong answers. Again, this is constant throughout the experiment. So you're either assigned to this no penalty condition or to the penalty condition. The second part is this SAT frame. So in the unframed treatment, you're going to walk into the lab. You see a sheet of instructions that says, this is a 20-question test. You get 1 point for a right answer, 0 points for a skipped question, and a penalty for wrong answers. There's no mention of the SAT until the very end when we ask you about whether you've taken these things. In the SAT framed, I sort of want to amp up this test-like atmosphere. So I want to sort of prime you with the feelings and nerves associated with taking standardized tests. So at the beginning of the experiment, when you sit down after you've signed your consent form and everything, I'm going to read aloud, and I'm going to tell you that the questions came from SAT 2 practice tests. Okay, we took these tests actually from SAT 2 practice tests. Here's what the SAT 2 practice tests typically measure. Okay, so they measure your ability to generalize, what you know about U.S. history, and I also tell them how colleges typically use their SAT 2 scores. So I say they're used for course placement, maybe extra credit, things like that. Okay, this is all to sort of get them in the mindset of, I'm taking an SAT. Okay, and finally, I'm going to use these raw point totals, these plus a point, minus a quarter of a point, and I'm going to convert them to a score on an 800-point scale, just to kind of put it over the top of making it feel like an SAT. Okay? The incentives are exactly the same. It's just a superficial change. I'm going to pay you based upon this 800-point scale instead of the other one, linear transformation. Okay. Are there any questions about the experimental design before I get more into results?
Would all of your subjects have taken or be familiar with the SAT? Would they either be American or have been in the American university system so that they know that?
So it's a good question. So I think the first thing is that there are a lot of foreign students now who actually take the SAT. Right. I only have data on whether or not they've taken these SAT tests. So I didn't ask them about experience with SAT in general.
So if they said no, it's possible they would have had the SAT framed, but...
Right, it's certainly possible. So I do have information on, where they went to college and what they're doing right now. And they all have to be eligible to be paid within the United States. So both of those things lead me to believe that they're somewhat familiar with the culture. They're registered at HBS, this lab. But I don't know that for sure. It's an interesting question. Do you have a question? Okay.
This is Sarah's point. I mean, we can only hope, but of course sample sizes are so small in the lab, but you can only hope that because of the randomization, you won't have one group only in the one treatment and the other group only in the other treatment, but sample sizes are still relatively small, that one would still worry.
Yeah, I would still worry. But 60% of my subjects are undergraduates, sort of in the Boston area sort of thing. So, okay. All right, so as I mentioned before, I ran these sessions at the Computer Lab for Experimental Research at HBS, so all the subjects were recruited from their standing subject pool. The subjects come in, they receive a $10 fee just for showing up. I give them a $5 fixed payment, and then they earn incentive pay between $0 and $10 based upon the points they earn.
It seems like a rather small point, but since you lose points for a wrong answer, but you never actually extract money from the person if they, for example, did horribly, So it seems like that does affect expected value a little bit in that they can never actually have a negative value.
Yeah, so the CLARE rules are that I guarantee them some minimum payment. So this is why I actually give them the $5 fixed payment so that I don't worry about stripping them down, like they're not giving me money out of their pocket. In principle, people could have lost money out of that $5 fixed payment. I don't think I had anyone do that low.
That answers my question.
Yeah. Okay. So I had 340 participants. They're roughly 50-50 male-female. They're about college-aged. And the median number of questions answered correctly on this is 12. Okay, so there are questions that people don't know the answer to on average. Okay, so here's the depiction of my 4 cells. And these are my sample sizes. So these look small in this no penalty treatment, but I'm going to show you that there's actually nothing going on in these cells, so that's why those are a little bit smaller. Here's just the mean number of questions skipped by treatment, so not breaking things down by gender yet. So you see that when there's no penalty for wrong answers, all subjects answer every question. I had 1 subject skip 1 question. Could have been a mistake, we don't really know. In the penalty treatments, we do have subjects skipping questions. These are all significantly different from each other, with the exception of these zeros, looking at distributions. And the second point is that it seems that people are skipping fewer questions with the SAT frame than in the no penalty, or in the no frame. Those are significantly different from one another as well.
Can I jump in here for a second? I mean, a possible frame that we may want to think about is that, but it seems like maybe not surprising that people don't skip questions when there's no penalty. There's other research suggesting that sometimes we are feedback averse. So we don't actually want to know that we might have been wrong. So we'd rather not even try, even if it's cheap, but there's a psychological cost to finding out that I got it wrong. So that's why you have to do this, to know whether, as a baseline, there's this nervousness about even learning afterwards that I was wrong.
Yeah, this actually surprised me. I expected to see some skipping in the no penalty treatment. So I think the feedback aversion is one explanation. The fact that we don't see it, I think, may be a result of the fact that these are lab participants. So these are people who like coming to the lab and answering questions, and a lot of them do it on a regular basis. So I worry a little bit about the selection of this population. Now we think it's balanced across cells, so I'm not going to worry about it too much for my comparison results. But I think this is one thing we worry about a little bit. So we're not just picking people randomly off the street. Okay, so let's talk about things for gender. So for sort of the rest of the talk, I'm going to throw out this no penalty. Just keep in mind that everyone answers every question when there's no penalty. Right, so here is the data broken down by treatment and by gender. So throughout the talks, I'm going to present means, but the statistical tests I'm using are always going to be tests of distributions. Okay, so I'm using Fisher-Pittman permutation tests for the most part. So in the unframed treatment, men skip on average about 2 questions and women skip 3. These aren't statistically different from one another, but obviously directionally women seem to be skipping more. And in the framed treatment, we actually have a significant difference between men and women. Right, so men skip on average about 1 question and women skip on average about 2. Partly this seems to be coming from the fact that the male behavior is significantly different under the SAT frame. This is directionally true for the women, but at least not statistically significant. Okay, so the men seem to be skipping fewer questions when the task is explicitly framed as an SAT. Again, these are just raw data, so we can look at them and kind of see what things look like overall, and the rest of the talk we're going to be diving into it in more detail. Okay, so we're going to figure out which of these differences are sort of real, and which ones can we explain with some of the data we collected. Yes?
What fraction of men and women did not skip any question? Yeah,
that's a good question. All right, so here are the proportion of subjects that answered every question. Okay, so proportion tests are hard, especially with the sample sizes I have. It's a lab experiment, so I'm not going to be able to statistically distinguish these. But I just want to point out that there is one cell that looks different from the rest. Right, so all of these are about 50%, but in this male with the SAT frame, we have about 60% of the subjects that answer every question. I can't distinguish those statistically. Right. So before I get into what about these gender differences, what's driving them, I want to convince you that this is a really important question. So the reason we care about skipping versus not skipping is that it's going to matter for your test score. So what I'm going to show you now is that test takers who answer every question do significantly better than test takers who skip questions. Now, in a way, this isn't surprising, right? I've told you that it's the expected score maximizing strategy. You might think that on average it's sort of a wash. Gee, they have no chance of getting it right. It won't matter. I'm going to show you that it really matters in terms of test score. Okay, so these are the sessions in which there's a penalty for wrong answers, because this is where we actually see skipping questions. Okay, so along the x-axis is the number of correct answers you had when I forced you to answer every question. Okay, so you could have gotten up to 20 answers correct. Okay, on the y-axis is your test score from part 1. So this is your total of 1 for every right answer, your penalty for wrong answers, and the zeros for skipping questions. The dark purple are the people who answered every question, and the light people are people who skipped at least one question. Okay? So we see that particularly among these well-informed people, right, skipping really matters. Okay? And in general, if we look at this graph, people who don't skip questions are outperforming people who do, and it's about one full question, or one full point, right? So if we look at someone, right, who got, let's look at this one. The median number of questions correct. So look at someone who got 12 questions right, and they skipped questions. They're only doing about as well as the person who answered every question that got 11 right. So it's like not knowing one additional answer.
Just a quick clarification question about them. So it says correct answers under forced response. Were they indeed forced to respond to all of them? So
Yes.
But they were allowed to skip? That's right.
No, so these are two different parts of the experiment.
Okay.
So this is part 3.
Yeah.
And I come back, I show you the exact same questions, and you have to answer every one or you get an error message.
Okay.
This is your score from part 1, where you were allowed to skip questions as you wanted to.
Okay. Thank you.
And so that's a really important distinction, because a lot of my data is going to be presented this way. This is what I like to think of as your true knowledge of the material, how you would have done when we forced you to answer everything. And this is the knowledge that's reflected in your part 1 SAT style test. Are there any other questions on that?
Were people always consistent, so they answered in three the same way?
For the most part, not always though. There are some mismatches. You might worry that people are hedging. I only pay you for one part of the test, or one part of the experiment. You could still think that people are hedging in some meta game, but for the most part, people's answers match across.
And the y-axis, is that with the SAT frame or without, or both combined?
These are both treatments combined.
And did you run both groups? Did you run one group with the SAT forced response in different? Did you run them in different orders, like so that one group took?
No, the test is always in the same order. So I did that because I wanted the SAT to feel as natural as possible, so I didn't want them playing any other lab sort of games before they took that SAT style test. So I come back at the end for everyone and collect this forced measure of knowledge of the material.
So do you think there was any learning effect that they could have remembered the answers?
They didn't see the answers after part 1. So they don't receive any additional information from the time they do part 1 to the time they do part 3.
Did you use the same ratio of time per question as the SAT uses?
So I didn't give them any time limits.
Oh.
So they come into the lab and I tell them they can work at their own pace. So that's an important aspect of SAT style tests that I don't factor in. In general, I think we'd expect skipping behavior to increase if we started imposing time limits, but I can't test that hypothesis here.
Just in terms of the learning question, I think it's a good question. I don't know whether you talked about you going on the job market. So this is a bit of practice talk also for your job
Yes.
market. So I'm seeing it that way. So ask hard questions. And we'll practice, right? And we'll practice in this environment. So the problem with the learning is the following. And I'm not too concerned if it doesn't have a gender-specific effect. But the problem with the learning is that, so I don't know whether I was right or wrong, but I might have guessed the first time around But now I had a little more time, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, right, that war was not in the 1800s, but it was actually, 1945, something, whatever. But and that's a crazy example. But I think in reflection, that sometimes happens to us. I'm like, oh no, how could I not have thought of Napoleon when I should have? And so I'm not too concerned. Actually, I'm not concerned because you look at gender differences. It would only be a concern if women thought of this, but not men. There's no gender theory to suggest that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I haven't thought about that too much, but you could worry that, either men or women, I'm not sure, I have an ex-ante hypothesis which way it would go, are being plagued by, thinking more constantly throughout the experiment about what those answers were, and now have more knowledge when they get to part 3. I'm trying to think, I'm not sure in my data there's a good way of actually testing whether that's going on. Yeah.
Actually, if anything, it would, from my experience with the bar exam and Barbary, they say always go with your first instinct, because the more time you have to think about it, the more likely you are to second guess yourself and undermine a correct answer. So actually they found if people come back to questions, like if they guess, I think it's A, but I'll come back to this question later, and then they come back, they do worse when you change your answer.
Oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Okay, so yeah, that's something to think about too then.
I don't know if you're going to get to this later, but do you have data on SAT scores with a gender breakdown in the U.S.?
Oh.
In terms of scores, like if, just in general, if young men or young women perform better?
So the data I have at this point is at the level of converted scores. So I see how you did on like a 800-point scale, and obviously aggregated to a huge level.
Yep.
What the data that would be interesting to me is how you get to that 800. So how many questions did you skip versus not skip? And that data is not publicly available. So we see how your score is converted, but we don't know if that was you got 160 answers right and skipped the other 10, or you got 165 right and got 10 wrong or something. It didn't add up. But.
In terms of the broader implication, though, I was just curious to see if there was a discrepancy or if there was a substantial difference between the performance of young men and young women in general on the SAT.
Yeah, so in general, they're very concerned with gender equality, and the aggregated scores at the 800 scale level look very similar across gender.
Okay.
The gender differences I mentioned at the beginning of the talk in terms of your SAT score then under-predicts your college performance if you're a woman, I think that's suggestive, but obviously there are a lot of things going on there. But yeah, I would love to get my hands on sort of more interesting SAT data, but as you can expect, it's harder to get a hold of.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, in terms of the question of second guessing, whether there was a gender difference in your data between the men and women who changed their answers.
So first, there's not a substantial amount of that going on, changing answers. I'm not sure if there's a gender difference off the top of my head. I think I've looked at it, and the fact that I don't remember makes me think that there's not one, but I don't want to go 100% on that, so I don't know. But I can find out for you.
But maybe worth
Yeah.
If ever that learning question comes up, which comes up, a lot. Economists will always think, but with learning, everything will change.
Yeah. Okay. So let me show you so we've seen the graph that skipping questions hurts performance. Here are some regressions that also indicate this. So these are just simple OLS regressions. So what I'm predicting here is your test score in part 1, right? We'd like to think that this is only a function of how many answers you actually know. So these are the correct answers you gave when you were forced to respond to every question, right? And this is hugely significant, right? It does matter. That's important. This is a good test. But what also matters is the number of questions you skipped. Okay, so as you skip an additional question, your test score is going down by about 1/4 of a point, right? And even when I add in controls for everything like whether or not you've taken this test and your risk preferences and your confidence, this coefficient doesn't go away. So it's not proxying something else. Okay. Similarly, we might think about sort of discrete cutoffs of where it's important to be. So maybe you don't get looked at by a certain class of schools if you don't have a test score in the top quartile or top 50%, something like that. So the dependent variable here in these probit regressions are just the probability that you scored in the top 50% of test takers in terms of part 1 score, this SAT style score. Again, your correct answers under forced response are very important. But this, whether or not you skipped questions, is also really important. Okay, so these are marginal effects. So this is saying being a person who answered every question as opposed to not, right, is a 30% change in how likely you were to be in the top 50%. Okay? So it's, I think the best way to think about it is in terms of correct answers you know, and it's akin to actually knowing one more answer is skipping, right, on this 20-question test. Okay, so we've thought about implications for performance. So I want you to keep that sort of in the back of your head as we talk about these gender differences and say, it's really important to be a person who answers every question. Okay, yeah?
It's been so long since I've been anywhere near the SAT or SAT2. Can you share with us how many questions are on the SAT2? Just in terms of if you're doing 20 here, what's, I forget how many are on that.
So on the SAT2, we're thinking about something like 80, 90 questions on most subject tests. It varies year to year and things like that. And the SAT1, since you're taking the math section and the verbal section, it's about 170. So a much, much longer test. Okay. And I want to emphasize, too, the other important difference to keep in mind is that I'm only giving them 4 possible answers, and these actual SATs have 5. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
And is one of those answers none of the above? On the SAT2s?
Not usually. So none of the questions I have are that. It's an interesting strategic thing, then, what that means.
Some of the tests I took, it was almost driven nuts.
Yeah. So I didn't use any questions like that. I'm not sure. All right, so I want to think about now this gender gap we saw in our table of raw data, and I want to think about sort of what's driving that. So I want to look at 4 main explanatory stories. The first one is just knowledge of the material. So I'd like to be able to rule out the story that women are skipping more questions just because they know less about these history questions. Okay, so I'm going to start just by showing you the data from the unframed sessions. So this is the unframed penalty treatment. Again, on this x-axis is the number of correct answers you gave when you were forced to answer. And on the y-axis is just how many questions you skipped. Okay, so we can think about people within the bucket as being similarly informed about this material. The women are in this pink shade and the men are in the blue. Okay. So we see that in general the trend is that as you know more about the material, you're skipping fewer questions. Okay, this isn't surprising. This falls for men and women. But keep in mind, the incentive is to actually answer all the questions regardless of how much you know. So we think that actually these should come down a little bit too. So let me show you the data from the frame treatment now. So we see in the frame treatment, the women actually still look pretty similar. So women are still sort of just answering the questions they know the answer to. Right? As the number of correct answers goes up, they're skipping fewer questions. Now the trend is actually different for men. Right? So men now, regardless of their knowledge of material, are answering most of the questions. So where we see a gender gap is among these lower performing half of men and women. So if we look at the top performing half of men and women, these people answer or skip on average 1 question. The lower performing men also skip on average 1 question, but the lower performing women skip on average 3. Okay, so this is where the big gender difference is. So I'll just show you the graphs on the same page, and I mostly just want to point out that the men are really the ones changing their behavior with this SAT frame, particularly the low performing men. Again, across subject, not within subject. So this is a complicated regression to look at, but I just want to make a point that I can't make even with the bar graphs. So the point here is that controlling for knowledge of the material actually is enough to explain the gender difference we saw in the unframed treatments. So the dark blue and the dark red. So once we control for the correct answers under forced response, there's no gender difference in the number of questions skipped for the unframed sessions. It's a different story in the SAT frame. So in the SAT frame, after we control for knowledge of the material, correct answers under forced response, we still see a significant effect of being a woman. Right? So the 4.076 says women are skipping more questions. And this interaction term of female time correct answers is saying is that downward trend of the women. Right? Women are skipping fewer questions as they know more about the material.
And how do we interpret the coefficients Are these 4 questions or
Sorry?
are these 4 questions? How do I interpret the coefficients on all of your coefficients? Are these numbers of questions skipped?
Yes, so this is predicting number of questions skipped.
It is literally,
Yes.
literally 4. I mean, that's a huge number.
Right, but we've got this dummy in here too. So this dummy is going to impact this as well. So you can think about this as multiplying times your correct answers.
Oh, right.
And that's going to shrink this quite a bit.
Right. Very good.
Yeah. Okay, so let me talk about some of these other stories too. So we see that within the SAT frame, knowledge of the material is not enough to explain the gender difference in questions skipped. The next thing I want to think about is confidence. So if we're thinking about what determines whether or not you answer a question, maybe it's less about whether you actually get that question right and more about whether you think you're going to get that question right. And that's where confidence comes in.
Katie, I'm sorry, I have to wear my advisor's hat again.
Yes.
At this point, people will jump in with all kinds of stories of, so why might this be the case?
Okay.
Now people want to start to guess and, what is happening with those men? Right? I mean, there's this one there's this one outlier where it really is this outlier of, as soon as you tell the man it's about SATs, somehow what they know doesn't matter anymore. They start to wildly guess.
Yeah, which is the expected score maximizing strategy.
No,
It's smart of them.
I know. I'm not saying this is bad. I am just neutrally describing it. But so then people will say, yeah, well, what is it? So I think you have to be prepared for that. But we also say, and I want to, I want to get back to this, or with the competitive attitudes, I want to really start unpacking why this might be the case. So not just say, okay, it's not knowledge, but really, because people now are curious.
Okay, so maybe the way to give the talk in the future is less suspense and more, what I'm going to show you in the next few minutes is that it's not knowledge of the material and it's not differences in confidence. Risk aversion tells part of the story, but not all of it. So we have a gender gap that remains even after controlling for these 3 factors. And that's what I'm going to start talking about competitive attitudes and what's going on with these men in the SAT frame. So that's where I'm going. Okay. So I don't actually find any gender differences in confidence, especially within this SAT frame. Okay, so this is the the penalty SAT frame treatment where we see the gender difference in questions skipped. The mean average stated belief of getting the question right, it's the same for men and women. Even once we control for whether you actually got that question right or not, there's no gender difference. So this female dummy, right, is not significant. So this, I'm just predicting your stated confidence for question I, your stated probability of getting it right. This is a dummy for whether or not you got the question right. Okay, so the fact that this is big and significant is a good indicator that people understood the elicitation and were responding in an informative manner. Okay. And there's actually no effect of being a woman, even when we interact that with being correct. So women are not less confident than men, whether or not they got the question right or not. Okay. So I think this is a clearer way of seeing the data. So the graph needs a minute to be explained, but I think it's going to be informative. So along the x-axis, what we have is your stated probability of answering the question correctly. So I'm going to look at an individual question, and I'm going to look at what you wrote down as your believed probability of getting that question right. And I'm going to sort those questions into buckets. So this bucket that says 40-50 is looking at all the questions for which subjects reported their odds of getting it right as being between 40 and 50%. Okay. Then on the y-axis is just the fraction of those questions that men and women skipped. Okay? So let's look at this 40-50 bucket again, right? So for questions that they thought they were around 50% sure of getting right, women skipped like 27% of those questions, and men only skipped 21% of those questions on average. So we see that within these bins, women are generally skipping more questions than men.
So, and you're about to explain to us about the competitiveness frame. But what's interesting is whether it's competitiveness or perhaps from the psychological frame, lack of fear of getting it wrong. Men seem pretty comfortable. 40-50% chance of getting it right, 40-50% chance, 60 to 50% chance of getting it wrong. Fine with me to guess. Whereas women, not fine for them.
Right. So I think what this graph is saying, so the last table I showed you said women and men are similarly confident about their answers. What this graph shows you is given a similar level of confidence about their answers, men and women are making different decisions. Okay, and that's pretty much true across the levels of confidence. So even for these questions, they think they're very likely to get right.
What do we make of the people who say 0 to 10%?
Yeah, this is, there's not that much data in this is true. So you can think of these people as, this is bad, right? Because choosing a robot to answer for you that's only right 15% of the time is worse than choosing an answer at random. So it's hard to make sense of these people. There actually isn't much data on the cell, which is why they're huge standard error bars. I could just take this data off the graph too, but yeah, we do have some people who report this. Okay, so I think, the likely explanation here of why men and women with similar levels of confidence might make different decisions could be a risk aversion story, right? So if a man and a woman both think they're 40% likely to get the question right, and a man decides to answer it and a woman decides to skip it, it might be because they're not, they don't have the same risk preferences. So the man prefers to take the gamble of getting 1 point 40% of the time and losing 1/4 of a point 60% of the time, and the woman prefers to decline that gamble. Okay, so I think telling that story makes you see this is exactly why I did part 2 the way I did. So if it is differences in risk preferences, we should see similar gender differences in the risk aversion elicitation. Okay. So I do have significant gender differences in risk preferences, okay, within this SAT frame penalty group. Okay, so I'm going to give you the riskiest gamble that they accepted. This is going to be my measure of risk aversion throughout. So remember, they had 20 gambles they saw. They accepted or declined each gamble. And what I'm reporting here is the riskiest gamble they were willing to take, right? So saying that they were the riskiest gamble they were willing to take paid off 39% of the time. It says they declined all gambles that paid off less than that and accepted gambles more than that. 80% of my subjects are consistent in that sense, where there is a clear threshold, but I have some subjects who flip around. They weren't ordered, and they were randomly chosen. So the inconsistency isn't all that surprising. But I don't want to spend too much time on that, but we can talk more about it at the end if people have questions. Okay, so here's just the representation of the data. So these are randomly drawn thresholds of risk. So this is why the numbers are a little funny, right? But they're between 25, and I have gambles that pay off more than this, but I don't show that data because almost everyone accepts them. Okay. So we see that for gambles that pay off between 25 and 50% of the time, a higher fraction of women decline the gamble than the men. Once the gambles are paying off more than 50% of the time, men and women look pretty similar in their decisions over these gambles. So I think this is interesting, right? Because if we think back to confidence and these multiple choice tests, this is a pretty important range for what decisions you make, right? A lot of the time we are going to be about 40, 50% sure we know the answer. And this says that at least when it's about random numbers, women are going to decline those gambles more often than men. Okay. So the important thing is, does this actually explain the gender gap in question skipped then? Is it just a risk aversion story? So in order to answer this, I have to do some regressions, right? Okay, so this is a probit. I'm predicting whether or not you skipped a question I. So I'm clustering at the subject level, and I'm looking at a certain question. Okay, so I'm predicting it on whether you're a woman, whether or not you actually got the question right when I forced you to answer it in part 3. There's an interaction of the two, and now I'm including this riskiest gamble you accepted and your confidence for that question. Okay, so the female dummy, without it, is about 6%. You're 6% more likely to have skipped the question if you're a woman. Once we control for risk, it falls to 5%, but it's still significant. Okay, so I think the answer here is that risk aversion is part of the story, and indeed it is significant in the regression. So more risk-averse subjects are skipping more questions. Risk preferences matter. So even if you didn't care about the gender implications at all, I think a takeaway of this paper is that these tests with penalties for wrong answers, are putting risk-averse people at more of a disadvantage. Okay. So I think the remaining explanations we're left with, I throw under this heading of competitive attitudes. So I think this is a cool way of using the data I collected to think about how much of the gender difference can be explained by your risk preferences and your confidence. So let me walk you through what this index is going to be. So I'm going to look at the questions, and I'm going to try and predict which questions you should have skipped, based upon what you told me about your risk preferences and your believed probability of getting them right. So I say you were predicted to skip question I if your stated probability of getting question I right, what you told me, was less than the probability of success of the riskiest gamble you accepted. Okay? So if you never accepted a random number gamble that paid off less than 50% of the time, then I predicted you skipped questions you were confident about, less than 50%. Okay, so this gives me a way of saying how many questions do your risk preferences and confidence tell me that you would have skipped. And if we see differences between these predicted numbers and the actual numbers, then we think something else is going on to determine why you're skipping questions. Okay, so let's talk about the women first. So for women, here are just the mean number of actual questions skipped in the unframed treatment and the SAT framed treatment. Here are their predicted number of questions skipped. Again, I'm presenting means, I'm testing distributions. So the point here is that these things are remarkably similar. So it looks like women are making decisions that are completely consistent with their risk preferences and their confidence. So they're going through, you can think of them as making some sort of expected utility calculation. Okay? And this is true in both the unframed and the SAT framed treatment. Right, so this is somewhat, I think these differences are sort of, you can think of them as these actual subject differences in coming in. These women just happen to know more about the material and be slightly more risk-loving. Right, so they're predicted and they're actually skipping fewer questions. Okay. So the important things is their actual and predicted look very similar in both of the treatments. Okay, so here are the men. Okay, so men skip about 2 questions on average in the unframed treatment, and 1 question on average in the framed treatment. Here are their predicted number of questions skipped. So in the unframed treatment, we can't distinguish. Okay? Directionally, they actually skip more questions than were predicted. But I think this is the interesting and important difference. So when we frame the task as an SAT, men seem to be answering more questions than would be predicted by their confidence and their risk preferences. Okay. So in 3 of the 4 cells, the 2 women and the men in the unframed, the predicted and actual look very similar. It's the 4th cell, these men in the SAT frame, that look like they're making decisions based upon something other than confidence and risk preferences. Okay. So I guess this is the question now. Is this something like,
Could you just remind us again, how do you frame the SAT besides giving them on the 800-point scale? What did you say to them?
Yeah. So I think the first important thing is I tell them that the questions are actually taken or adapted from actual SAT-2 practice tests. So they know the questions are SAT questions, and that's not true in the other treatment. They're just told they're history questions. So that's one important difference. The other thing I do is I use passages that are actually provided by the College Board, so they're on the College Board website, that tell you what SAT-2s are designed to measure. So these are the skills that we're measuring with this test. And the second passage is, these are how colleges use these tests. So you submit them to the college, they're going to use it to determine your course placement and things like that. And then I tell them I'm going to convert this score. I think the score part of it is probably the least important, but I have no way of distinguishing what's actually driving this.
But these are people who've already taken the SATs and presumably, so I love that it's competitive even though it will have no effect on them.
And so
it's not as if you were doing with high school students and they really thought that it was going to make a difference, right?
For sure. And I want to stress too, I'm calling this competitive attitudes. I'm not sure this is exactly the right word. You don't know what anyone else does. You're not paid relative to what anyone else does. Okay, so there's no explicit competition in this setting. I think, competitiveness is kind of associated with standardized tests in general because scores are compared across students in the quote-unquote real world. But there's no explicit competition within my experiment.
And given that,
I think that we see the behaviors, because the SAT is competitive, you in essence are drawing in the frame of competitiveness from it. I think what's interesting is I think what we actually see perhaps is that it's more of a performance stance.
Yeah.
I mean, we clearly need to know more, but I think there's a set of attributes which we see interplay around gender when in a competitive mode. But what you're saying is here, where the competitive mode is actually removed,
Yeah.
you see the same performance difference.
Yeah.
So I think it's really more of a performance difference.
Yeah, I think.
Like this set of attributes and behaviors.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit more about this. I think that's a good point. We think about sort of how people behave in these sort of environments and maybe some triggers that are, once you think about competition, how you perform.
Have you considered doing a measure of testosterone or cortisol with the study?
So I've thought about it. I would be very interested in doing it. I think that would be exciting.
I can't see what effect it takes place, and it's a trigger. I'm like, perhaps it release testosterone to change behaviors.
It would be an interesting route to go, for sure.
Oh.
Yeah. Yes.
I think it would have been interesting to set the whole thing into two different frameworks, like where people actually observe each other's test scores. I don't know if you can do this in future research or something to see if this effect becomes stronger when, maybe in this treatment, I don't know if people talk to each other afterwards, like students.
So I can't perfectly observe that after they leave the lab. So I think that's a really important point. So I'm trying to understand now. I mean, to be honest, when I ran this, right, I kind of expected that confidence and risk aversion would tell a lot of the story. And now I'm left thinking, okay, well, what is going on and how can we design treatments to understand it better? So I think unpacking now, is it competition? What about competition? I think, one way of doing that is making things more public. Yeah, definitely. I think that's an interesting route to go.
No question and comment. Question, I'm assuming most of them were youngish men, but were you able to look at age variability, considering the literature that adolescents are much more?
So I have the strongest effects among the current undergraduates. So as they get older, the effects seem to dissipate.
And so like I said, the question and comment is that, is there any literature to suggest, I can't imagine that women are less likely to be triggered by past experiences? I mean, so it could be theoretically that women, if it was really a competitive, like an SAT, a real SAT, their testosterone levels might go up, or they might become more competitive, but where women are much more rational, and they don't fall prey to like hypothetical situations.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I don't know of any papers off the top of my head that look at that, but I should look into it more. Yeah, let me show you the couple of slides I have on these sort of competitive attitudes and let you know the kinds of things I'm thinking about that might matter for this. Okay, so the two things I've thought about in particular are sort of the economics literature on differences in preferences for competition. So when we're placed in a competitive environment, do we actually like to compete? Do we seek out competitive environments to sort of perform in? And then also the literature on stereotype threat. So let me talk about both of these things. Okay, so this paper, this is kind of the first in a ever-growing literature by Nisi et al. And they have, people, I think the original one is they're doing mazes. And when you're paid piece rate, so just based upon the number of mazes you complete, men and women look very similar. But then when you're placed in a tournament environment where only the winner is going to earn pay, male performance greatly improves and female performance doesn't. Okay, so I think there's literature that shows that maybe men prefer competitive environments, select into competitive environments. But again, there's not a very clear link to my study, right? There's no explicit pay in my setting. You don't find out about anyone else's performance. But if we think that there is something about preferences for competition, this could be something that individuals are bringing into the lab, right? They think of tests as being competitive environments, and they're sort of bringing their preferences for competition. And we're seeing that sort of in the way they perform. So it's something we definitely have to run more treatments on to figure out, what's going on. So the second is literature on stereotype threat. So we classically think of stereotype threat as being told something negative, right? A negative stereotype and that impeding performance. There's some literature now that actually shows that priming positive stereotypes can improve performance on these tests. So the She paper, they prime a female's Asian American identity before they take a math test, and they actually do better on the test than when they're not primed with that. So it could be possible that this SAT frame that I'm imposing in the beginning triggers some sort of self-stereotypes that people hold about how they should do on these tests. Okay. Again, I don't ask people their gender or remind them of their gender before the task at all, so there's no explicit stereotype being called forth by the experimenter. But it may be that just telling them that this is an SAT is sort of triggering, again, this triggering word, different self-stereotypes in our test takers. If this is what's going on, I think the interesting question is, well, why would men and women hold different self-stereotypes in this environment? One thing that I've been thinking about is just preferences for type 1 and type 2 error, right? So maybe for men, what's really painful is taking a test and skipping a question that you would have gotten right. That kind of error is somewhat costly. And for women, what could be more costly or differentially costly is going through and getting a question wrong. Right? So if those two kinds of errors are differentially painful for men and women, that could be one explanation of the behavior we see in this SAT frame. Again, I don't have data that can sort of test these stories, but these are the things I'm thinking about as I'm designing treatments going forward. So given that this is the direction I'm going, I think an interesting subpopulation to look at is actually the people who are at elite undergraduate universities. So we might think that when we tell students that this is an SAT, that actually triggers different responses in different people. So presumably, if you're at a really good undergraduate school, maybe something in the Cambridge area, that you might have had positive experiences with tests in the past. Right? So you can probably do all these things like compute expected values. You know what the expected score maximizing strategy is. We might think that you see these things, you think, gee, I'm going to do really well on this. And that sets you off on a different path than the rest of the population. So it was with that in mind that I wanted to look at this subpopulation and see what was going on. So
you can also frame it a little bit as an experts. Because often, there are many experimental comments always ask, would experts also fall prey to these problems? And that sounds a bit like it. These are the experts. I mean, they are here probably because they've done quite well in these tests.
Yeah, and this is an interesting kind of expert because they're test-taking experts, but they're not necessarily the experts in history.
No, that's exactly right. That's what I meant, yeah.
Right, yeah. Okay, so I have about 30 men and women in this cell of the SAT-framed penalty. Okay, so ex ante, I actually thought that we'd expect less gender difference in this cell. These are the men and women who know the right strategy. These are the women who have learned to guess. Okay, and I actually find the opposite. Okay, so among the students at elite universities in this SAT frame, basically what's driving this is men are skipping far fewer questions, right? They're skipping only half a question on average. And the women at elite universities are skipping 2.5 on average. Okay, so these men are different from the rest of their sample. And obviously the men and women within these elite student populations are different from one another. So we might worry these are small sample sizes, the means don't tell us that much. So let's think about proportions now. Right? So actually 75% of men in this cell answer every question. Okay? And fewer than half the women are answering every question. This is really, and we see that when we look at the rest of the sample, there's actually not that much going on. It seems to be being entirely driven by these student and elite universities. In particular, these men at elite universities are really amping up the number of questions they answer in this SAT frame. This is just a spreadsheet here, a histogram here of the data. So we see the big gap in the people who answer every question, and the women are shifting to the right.
What's funny is really an alternative narrative, and even though I've heard your research before, what's really interesting is one could also look at this, that within the elite population, women haven't had to guess in order to access and achieve in elite institutions, whereas men, in order to compete, had to guess.
That's interesting.
Right, and if we look at our population within elite universities across the U.S., where we basically have 50% female enrolled, and we now know that 50 or slightly more than 50% actually is performing with less guessing. Their scores are truer, so to speak, that they aren't getting a bump from the type of test. I mean, we tend to look at it because women are viewed as a minority and are oppressed in a million ways, but if we just look at this, if we walked in here beamed in from another planet, like that's a pretty accurate narrative.
Yeah.
That in essence the test is lifting men.
Yep. Yeah. So
It's designed to give those who do not know a benefit.
yeah.
So it in essence handicaps men. Where, if one looked at a sports analogy where you give... handicaps as in...
Yeah,
it gives a handicap.
Yeah, okay.
It gives them an extra bump so that they can compete.
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting story. In the way I've been talking about it too, when I think about, when I've been framing it in terms of men are doing well and women are doing badly, it's important that this willingness to guess, I'm talking about it in the context of this setting, right? So on my test, in this test, and in the SAT, right, it benefits you to be willing to guess. So that's why I'm thinking of that as the kind of the normatively correct thing.
Right.
We might think there are a variety of settings and other tests where it actually benefits you maybe not to guess and be slightly more cautious.
Like in real life.
We don't care about that.
Yeah, let me take some of these other questions too.
I think you have on the one hand you have the benefit that you can get more points and get more money basically, right? And on the other hand you have a certain cost of saying an answer to something where you're not sure if it's right or wrong. I'm wondering if you increase the stakes so you actually pay more, you pay them more for what they can get. I was wondering, if the difference becomes smaller between women and men or not.
Yeah. Relatively, that's sort of what the no penalty does, right? The gain relative to the loss is kind of at a limit almost because there's no loss. It'd be interesting if you approach that sort of at what point does the gender difference go away? Does it matter if there's a tiny, tiny fraction versus no penalty at all? I think that would be an interesting thing to look at too.
Right. So you can use the penalty. You can also use the money amount per point one. Right?
Yeah.
So
I could also do that.
For example, to make the stakes higher.
Yeah, I could definitely do it with higher stakes. Yes.
Well, in real life, the time constraint is a key factor on taking an exam. And so skipping a question is a key element in your time management strategy. Because when you skip a question, if you're unsure, you have a better chance of catching up with the question when you do know the answer, spending your time more productively.
Yeah. So I think this is a good point. I want to argue that if you're taking a test like that and you're unsure about the answer and you're concerned about time, one strategy could be, I'm going to write down the first thing that comes to mind, my best guess, fill that in, and leave something next to it that says, come back to this, just like I would if I had skipped it. Right? And that strategy, if you don't get to come back to it, is going to give you a higher expected value than the strategy of skipping and then coming back later. But I think this idea that skipping is also a time management thing is important. And there might be gender differences in the way people use the skipping to sort of manage their time. But
what you've done is a kind of Moneyball analysis. you know
I know Michael Lewis's book, yeah. I love that book. I'm flattered. So thinking about the time management question is definitely important. The college...
What I meant by that was that these percentages are arcane things known only to those of you who know how to use them. That's what I meant by Moneyball analysis.
Yeah, with the number of people now who take SAT prep courses, I'm going to say that these things are actually pretty well known and people are coached to be using the strategies, which I think makes this even more surprising. Especially people at Harvard, you think they've kind of learned the strategies. And when they come in and they answer the risk preference questions, right, everyone's doing that calculation. And I actually do a couple of sessions where I debrief people and I ask them to write down how they made their decisions. And most people tell me, I had some threshold, and if I'm more confident than this threshold, I answer, and if not, I don't. So I think people are thinking about it sort of in the way that we as economists would also think about it. But obviously not to the extent that we are. So and one point on the time management thing too is the College Board says that 80% of test takers finish the entire test, and some even higher fraction have a chance to see every question. So the SAT's goal is not to time constrain people to the extent that they're forced to leave things blank. They would like everyone to be able to answer every question. And I think for most people out there, being able to see and answer every question is going to be reasonable for them. So I saw there were other questions too.
Your explanatory tree that you've come down, I think, started with knowledge, then went to confidence, then went to risk, and then came to competition. Does this slide imply that maybe that explanatory tree should actually start with a different segmentation, and that segmentation is a function of, in this case, you happen to use elite universities. When you look at the 4 cells, there's only one that's unique.
Yeah.
So does that, and the rest of the sample is pretty consistent. So is the explanatory power of this analysis actually in that top line?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. So yes, in all of the things I showed you, you can imagine seeing all of those graphics and doing it just for the students at elite universities, and you would see the same pictures and the same regressions. And then if you looked at the rest of the sample with the elite students stripped out, you wouldn't see nearly as much action. So this is important. For sure. So yes, in a sense, this is the biggest explanatory variable.
But I think the question that you raise is, do you need to go back now to your regressions after this and interact with elite?
Yeah.
You know, is it all in that cell? Is your male? I mean, I hope not. I hope it's not just that. I mean, no. What can I say? I mean, it's still very, very interesting, but it is an interesting question, right? Is the gender effect basically only in that cell? I think you have to do that interaction.
Yeah. So part of the issue, and I have gone back and done a lot of the regressions. You know, once you start running these interactions with, I only have 30 men and women in these elite universities. There's just, I would need to collect more data to be able to identify things well. And you know, what I would like to be able to do too is that collect more data in this unframed, so I can figure out what elite students in the unframed look like and compare those as well.
Maybe have that as a backup slide in case someone that with the interaction, someone
Okay.
asks, then say what you just said, but also say, when you run it, you find X.
Yeah, yeah.
People might still want to see it.
Okay, okay. Yes.
On the last slide, I wonder how many elite students are in the chart.
The histogram?
Yeah, how many students are there?
So it's 30 men and it's 27 men and 29 women.
Okay.
And importantly, everything works if you throw out the 3 women who are out here.
Yeah, what happened there? Like a couple people just didn't really answer any questions. How could that happen? What's behind that?
So I don't have a good story of why this person skipped 17 questions or 18 questions. I think it's 17, but. Everything still works if you throw these people out. And I think the big part of it is the drop here, right?
So that person has the philosophy of throw it all to chance.
No, they didn't get.
No, it didn't answer. Is this question skipped? Yeah, skipped rather like actually skipped.
All right, let me give you my last 2 conclusion slides so we can wrap up. Okay, so I just want to relate this back now to sort of thinking about test scores and things like that. So among these students at elite universities, the women are skipping on average about 2 more questions than men. So what does this actually mean in terms of scores? I think this number here is really important. So if we thought that the people who are skipping questions really kind of had a uniform chance of getting it right, and it's not going to matter that much anyway, actually the probability of getting a question right that you skipped is almost 50% for these subjects. Okay, so they have a really good chance of getting it right if they do answer it. This number isn't significantly different for men and women. So that means the approximate expected value of answering 1 additional question in my study, where there are only 4 possible answers, is about 1/3 of a point. Okay, so let's do a really rough back of the envelope calculation. There are lots of stories of why we might observe different behavior on the SAT-1. I want to stress that, but I just want to tie it to what the numbers are. So the SAT-1 has about 170 multiple choice questions. Okay, so if they skip 2 more questions than men for every 20, and the expected value of answering an additional question is about 1/3, okay, that's 5.5 raw points on the SAT score. Okay, and that translates usually using the typical SAT conversion things to about 70 points. So obviously there's a lot going on, but I think this has the potential to be an important factor in your score. So we should try and understand better which people are skipping and sort of why. Okay, so just concluding, I show that women skip more questions than men when there's a small penalty for wrong answers, and that the gender gap is most pronounced when this evaluative nature of the task is made salient. Okay, so risk preferences and confidence alone are not enough to tell this story. There's something else going on, and we have to think about what that something else is and why it interacts particularly with being a student at an elite university. And I think it's easy to encourage this audience, well, why should we care, right? So when we have penalties for wrong answers, which is how most standardized tests work now, right, we may be encouraging risk-averse test takers and women, at least in my sample, to skip more questions. And this has a significant and negative impact on their test scores. So I think the question is, well, can we design better tests? So in my study, removing the penalty for wrong answers successfully encourages everyone to answer every question. Are there coaching strategies that could work to overcome this? And this is of interest to me as a theorist, actually thinking about the theoretical sort of side of test design. So using these same sort of multiple choice formats, could we design tests that kind of encouraged everyone to answer every question? So here's one idea. So you've got a multiple choice question. There are 5 possible answers. Right now, we just ask you to submit your best answer or nothing. Imagine instead you were asked to rank the answers from most likely to be true to least likely to be true. You get 0 points if you leave it blank, and you always get positive points if you rank the right answer somewhere. With an increasing number of points, the higher you rank it. Okay, so a test like that, it's always strictly preferred, regardless of your risk preference, to answer the question. We get a little bit more information from test takers, and we allow them to express some uncertainty. So maybe you feel more comfortable if you can say, gee, it's what I think is most likely to be true, but here's what I think is second most likely to be true. Right? So this is something that I want to think more about from the theoretical side, but also from the experimental side. Can we try this out? Can test takers figure out how to use this kind of test, and does it give us some more accurate measures of knowledge of the material? And I'm happy to take more questions in the time we have left.
Well, just a direction for, when you're thinking about alternate forms, even moving away from multiple choice. The last question on, when I took the GRE to come here, the last question was a fill-in-the-blank math question. I don't know if that was like an experimental section or what, but, that could be another direction that these things are going.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of advantages to the multiple choice format just in terms of ease of grading and things like that. We can kind of feed it into a computer. But yeah, there are other things. If you relax the multiple choice constraint, we might be able to even do better.
Going back to the first question, ETS's rationale for penalizing for wrong answers, it has to be more than just it's difficult to force people to, because you could force people to answers by penalizing them for leaving blanks. I mean, there must be some.
So one interesting thing is the AP tests. So these tests that high schoolers take also in subjects used to penalize people for wrong answers, and they've now removed the penalty. Their stance is that it doesn't matter whether you have a penalty or not, so we're just going to take it off. It seems like they must have better research than that, but they're not releasing it.
It's perplexing.
Yeah, so I think the obvious story for having a penalty is somewhat to discourage totally uninformed guessing. But
And Katie, do you want to take a last question?
Yes, I will take a last question.
I just really quickly, did the gender gap change at all between male and female performance when they changed whether or not there was a penalty on the AP test? Do you know?
Oh, I don't know. So they just removed the penalty this year. Or it may have been for the test last spring, but I think it's too soon to tell.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And this is our last seminar of the semester. Next semester will commence again on the 2nd of February with Kathleen McGinn from Harvard Business School. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us over these many months.